Jacob Reed had built his small diner chain from the ground up. Over the last 10 years, he had expanded from a single location to 13 diners across different towns. It wasn't the biggest brand, but it had a reputation for warmth, quality food, and a family-friendly atmosphere, or at least it used to. Lately, something had changed. Customer complaints were piling up. Reports of slow service, rude staff, and long wait times were becoming more common. Employee turnover was at an all-time high. His regional managers assured him that everything was running smoothly. They had explanations for every issue: short staffing, seasonal fluctuations, a few bad hires. But Jacob wasn't convinced. The numbers didn't lie. Frustrated and determined to get to the bottom of it, Jacob decided there was only one way to find out the truth. He would go undercover. The disguise. Jacob picked a diner 2 hours away from his corporate office, a location where most employees had never met him in person. To blend in, he made a few changes. He grew out a scruffy beard, traded his tailored suits for a worn-out hoodie and jeans, and put on thick-rimmed glasses. He let his hair grow slightly unkempt, completing the look of an average, unremarkable customer. By the time he was done, he looked nothing like the polished executive from his company's website. This wasn't just about watching. He needed to feel what it was like to work at his diner as an employee or dine as a regular customer. And so Jacob Reed, the CEO, stepped into his own business as just another hungry patron. First impressions. The diner looked clean but worn down. The booths were slightly tattered, the decor felt dated, and while nothing was outright wrong, it lacked the warm, welcoming energy that had once defined his brand. Then a waitress approached. Her name tag read, Megan. "Hi there." "Welcome," she said, offering a polite but tired smile. Jacob noticed the faint bags under her eyes, the way she hesitated before smiling, as if she had to force herself to be cheerful. "Just coffee, thanks," Jacob said as he slid into a booth near the window. Megan nodded and hurried off, skillfully weaving between tables, juggling multiple orders, refilling drinks, and running plates. She was efficient, but overworked. Jacob had always preached the importance of valuing employees. But if Megan was struggling, how many others were as well? As he watched, he heard a voice boom from the kitchen. "Megan, what's taking so long? You're falling behind again." A short, stocky man wearing a stained apron stood near the kitchen window, glaring at Megan. Jacob guessed he was the shift manager. He hadn't introduced himself to Jacob when he entered, which was already a red flag. Megan flinched at the harsh tone but quickly nodded and called back, "Coming right up." Her voice cracked slightly as she turned away. Jacob frowned. This was not the company he had built. Something was very wrong here, and he was about to find out just how bad things had gotten. Jacob sipped his coffee, watching the diner's operations unfold. The food smelled good. The customers seemed ordinary. But there was a tension in the air that he couldn't ignore. At the booth behind him, a family was whispering about how long their food was taking. Across the room, two teenagers murmured about how rude the manager had been to their waitress earlier. The conversations around him painted a picture of a place where patience was running thin, not just among the staff, but the customers as well. When Megan returned with his burger and fries, she placed the plate down with an apologetic expression. "Sorry about the wait," she said softly, avoiding eye contact. "No worries," Jacob replied with a small smile. "You're doing great." She looked surprised for a moment before nodding quickly and hurrying off. Jacob had barely taken a bite when he heard something that made him freeze. Muffled sobbing. It was coming from the kitchen. He set his fork down, his appetite vanishing as he strained to listen. "I'm trying my best, okay?" Megan's voice cracked through the thin walls. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours and I'm doing everything I can." A familiar, sharp voice cut in. The manager. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job. We don't have time for excuses." Jacob's stomach turned. He couldn't sit still anymore. He slid out of the booth, leaving his half-eaten burger behind, and walked toward the kitchen door. A culture of fear. The moment Jacob stepped inside the kitchen, he saw the scene unfold before him. Megan stood near the prep counter, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. The shift manager, the man Jacob now knew as Rick, loomed over her, arms crossed, his face twisted in frustration. Two cooks stood nearby, their eyes fixed on their stations, avoiding the scene unfolding in front of them. It was clear they were uncomfortable, but none of them dared to step in. Jacob clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. He wasn't here as the CEO. Not yet. Is there a problem here? His voice was calm but firm. Rick turned, startled by the interruption. No, he muttered, straightening slightly. Just a little miscommunication. Megan shook her head, tears still pooling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. Jacob ignored Rick and looked directly at her. She looks like she needs a break, he said. Why don't you let her sit down for a few minutes? Rick scoffed. We're short-staffed. There's no time for breaks during the rush. Jacob's jaw tightened. There's always time to treat people with respect. The room fell silent. One of the cooks, a wiry young man, hesitated before speaking up. Megan's been non-stop since she clocked in, he said quietly. She hasn't even had time to grab a drink of water. Rick shot him a glare. Stay out of it, Connor. Focus on your station. Jacob's eyes flicked to Connor, then back to Rick. And who's in charge of making sure your team can focus? Jacob asked, his voice deceptively calm. Because from where I'm standing, the pressure isn't coming from the customers. It's coming from how this place is being run. Rick's face flushed. His bravado slipped for just a moment before he crossed his arms again. Look, I'm just doing my job, he muttered. If people can't handle it, that's not on me. Jacob held his gaze. We'll see about that. Megan wiped her face again, still visibly shaken. I'll be fine, she mumbled, her voice weak. She turned toward the door, but Jacob gently stopped her. Take 5, he said softly. You've earned it. Rick opened his mouth to protest, but Jacob held up a hand, his tone leaving no room for argument. She's taking a break. Now. Megan hesitated for only a moment before slipping past the swinging kitchen doors, vanishing into the dining area. Jacob turned his attention back to Rick. His voice was calm but firm. What's your name? Rick, the man said, his tone defensive. And who are you to come in here and tell me how to run my shift? Jacob ignored the question. How long have you been the manager here, Rick? Rick folded his arms. About 2 years, and I've kept this place running just fine, so I don't need some random customer stepping in. And you call this fine? Jacob interrupted. His voice was quieter now, but far more dangerous. Rick hesitated. Your staff is overworked, your customers are complaining, and you're berating people in the middle of their shifts. That's not fine. It's a mess. Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Jacob cut him off again. You might want to think about how you're treating people, he said, his voice measured. Because if I were your boss, this wouldn't fly. Rick's face paled slightly, but he quickly tried to cover it with a scoff. Well, you're not my boss, so... Before he could finish, the kitchen doors swung open and Megan reappeared. Her face was slightly more composed, but she kept her head down as she walked past Rick and back toward the dining area. Jacob decided to step back and observe again, for now. He gave Rick one last pointed look before following Megan back into the dining room. A plan begins to form. Back at his booth, Jacob watched as Megan returned to her routine. She moved a little slower now, her exhaustion more apparent, but she still managed a small smile for every customer she served. He also noticed Rick watching her from the kitchen window, his expression unreadable. Jacob took out his phone and discreetly started taking notes. He jotted down everything he had observed, Rick's behavior, Megan's workload, the complaints from customers. He also noted Connor's quiet defense of his coworker. By the time Jacob had finished his meal, his decision was made. He flagged Megan down. Can I get the check? He asked, keeping his tone light. She nodded quickly, bringing it over along with the receipt. Thanks for stopping by, she said quietly. Sorry again about earlier. No need to apologize, Jacob replied, slipping some cash into the billfold. You're doing great. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and for the first time, she gave him a real smile. Thank you, she whispered. As she walked away, Jacob made a decision. He wasn't done here, not by a long shot. He grabbed his jacket and made his way to the door, but before stepping outside, he glanced back at the diner one last time. Megan was refilling a customer's coffee, her movements careful but efficient. Rick was barking orders at Connor in the kitchen. Jacob's jaw tightened. He pushed open the door and stepped outside, pulling out his phone. "Janet," he said when his assistant answered, "I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow and get me everything we have on the staff at the suburban location. Employee files, performance reviews, all of it." "Got it," Janet replied. "Anything else?" Jacob glanced back at the diner before walking toward his car. "Yeah," he said. "Make sure my regional managers are ready for a meeting. We need to talk." Tomorrow he wasn't just going to observe, he was going to take action. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the diner just after opening, wearing the same scruffy disguise as the day before. This time, he carried a small notebook in his pocket and a renewed sense of determination. Today, he wasn't just watching, he was going to start fixing things. The morning shift was quieter, giving him a better chance to observe the staff without the chaos of the lunch rush. Megan was already on the floor, her movements deliberate but slower than yesterday. She looked even more drained, her smile thinner. Rick wasn't in sight yet, but Connor was in the kitchen prepping ingredients. Jacob waited until Megan passed by with a coffee pot before calling her over. "Hey, Megan," he said, keeping his tone casual. "Do you have a second?" She hesitated, glancing at the few customers scattered around the diner. Sure, but I can't stay long. We're short-staffed again." "I won't keep you," Jacob promised. "I just wanted to ask, how long have you been working here?" She blinked at the question, clearly caught off guard. "About 8 months." "Why?" Jacob leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You seem like you're carrying a lot on your shoulders. Is it always this busy?" Megan hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen window. "It's not always the customers," she said carefully. "Sometimes it's—" She trailed off, biting her lip. "It's Rick, isn't it?" Jacob asked gently. Her head snapped up, and for a moment she looked panicked. "I shouldn't—" "You don't have to say anything," Jacob interrupted, keeping his voice soft. "I just want to understand what it's like for you here." Megan hesitated again, then sighed. "It's not just him. It's everything. We're always short-staffed, and when things get hectic, he just makes it worse. I know he's under pressure too, but it feels like we're always the ones paying for it." Jacob nodded, his mind racing. He decided to push a little further. "What about Connor? He seems like he tries to help." Megan's expression softened slightly. "Connor's great. He's only been here a few months, but he's one of the few people who actually cares. He covers for people when they're struggling. Honestly, if it weren't for him, I probably would have quit by now." Before Jacob could ask any more questions, the kitchen door swung open and Rick strode out. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Megan's shoulders tensed, and she quickly excused herself to refill a customer's coffee. Rick didn't seem to notice Jacob as he barked instructions at Connor, who nodded silently while dicing vegetables. Jacob's jaw tightened as he watched. This wasn't just stress. This was a pattern. The breaking point, Jacob let the morning play out, watching how Rick interacted with the staff and how the team managed despite the clear tension. By the time the lunch rush started, the diner was back to its usual pace, and Megan was running between tables again. It wasn't long before the first incident occurred. A customer, an older man in a flannel shirt, flagged Megan down, looking annoyed. "My eggs are overcooked," he said, shaking his head. "Can you just do your job right the first time?" Megan's face flushed, but she kept her composure. "I'm really sorry about that. I'll get it fixed right away." Rick, who had overheard the exchange, stormed out of the kitchen. "What's the problem here?" he demanded, glaring at Megan. The customer waved him off. "She's handling it." Rick turned to Megan anyway. "How many times do I have to tell you to double-check the orders before they go out? This is basic stuff." Jacob stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, drawing everyone's attention. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. Rick turned to him, his face twisting in annoyance. "And who the hell do you think you are?" Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his company ID. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "I'm Jacob Reed," he said, locking eyes with Rick. "I own this diner, and 13 others just like it." The room went silent. Megan froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Connor peeked out from the kitchen, his knife still in hand. Even the customers seemed to hold their breath. Rick's face went pale, then flushed red. I didn't realize—" "No, you didn't," Jacob cut him off. Because if you had, you wouldn't be treating my staff like this. Or my customers. Rick stammered, but Jacob didn't give him a chance to recover. Let's talk. In the back. Now. Rick hesitated, then nodded stiffly and walked toward the office. Jacob followed, pausing only to glance at Megan. I won't let this slide, he said quietly. Confrontation in the office. Inside the small manager's office, Jacob shut the door and turned to Rick. Do you have any idea how out of line you've been? He asked, his voice low but firm. Rick opened his mouth, but Jacob held up a hand. Save it. I've seen enough. Rick swallowed hard. You've been with this company for 2 years, Jacob continued, and in that time, you've managed to create a toxic environment for your team. Do you have any idea what that does to morale? To customer service? To the business? Rick looked down, his bravado completely gone. I get it. No, Jacob said, his voice cold. You don't. Because if you did, I wouldn't be standing here telling you this. Rick swallowed again. I can do better. You're done. Rick's head shot up, eyes wide. Wait, you can't. I can, Jacob said firmly. And I will. You're fired, effective immediately. Rick stood frozen for a moment before nodding stiffly and walking out of the office without another word. Jacob let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. He didn't enjoy firing people, but this was necessary. Change begins. When Jacob stepped back into the dining area, all eyes were on him. Megan and Connor stood near the kitchen, their expressions a mix of shock and cautious hope. Jacob took a deep breath and addressed the room. I want to thank everyone for their hard work, he said, his voice steady. Things are going to change around here, starting today. He looked directly at Megan and Connor. You two, meet me after your shift. We need to talk. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a buzz of curiosity and relief. Jacob knew this was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was steering his company in the right direction. After the last customer left and the lights dimmed in the dining area, Megan and Connor stood awkwardly near the counter, waiting for Jacob to speak. The hum of the kitchen appliances was the only sound in the room. Both of them looked exhausted, but there was a cautious hope in their expressions. Jacob had spent the rest of the day observing without interfering further, but now it was time to act. All right, let's sit, Jacob said, motioning toward a booth in the back. He slid into one side while Megan and Connor hesitated before sitting across from him. Jacob leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. First, I want to say thank you, he began. I know today was rough, especially with everything that happened, but you both handled yourselves with professionalism and care. That's more than I can say for some of the leadership this place has had. Megan glanced at Connor, unsure how to respond, while Connor fidgeted with the edge of his apron. Jacob sighed. I didn't know things had gotten this bad, he admitted. That's on me. I've been too distant. I built this company to be a place where people feel valued, employees and customers. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. Megan finally spoke, her voice hesitant. It's not all bad. I mean, I've worked worse jobs, but it's been hard. She hesitated. I do love the customers, though. I just wish... She trailed off, unsure if she should say more. Wish what? Jacob prompted gently. She sighed. I just wish it felt like someone cared, you know? Like, really cared about us. Not just about the numbers or how fast we can turn tables. Jacob nodded, letting her words sink in. Then he turned to Connor. And what about you? Connor looked up, his voice quiet but steady. Honestly, I didn't plan to stay long, but I couldn't leave. Not with how much Megan and the others have to deal with. Someone needs to have their back. Jacob felt a pang of guilt. These two were the backbone of this diner, keeping things together while he sat in an office, trusting reports and spreadsheets. Well, that changes now, Jacob said firmly, but I'm not just going to tell you things will improve. I'm going to show you. Both Megan and Connor looked at him, curiosity and skepticism flickering in their eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Jacob continued. First, I'm bringing in a new manager, someone with experience, but also someone who knows how to lead with respect. In the meantime, I'll personally oversee things here until we get everything on track. Megan's eyes widened. You mean you're staying? Jacob nodded. For as long as it takes. Connor tilted his head. And Rick? He's not coming back, Jacob said simply. I don't tolerate that kind of behavior, and neither should you. Connor let out a small breath of relief, while Megan's shoulders sagged as if a weight had been lifted. Second, Jacob continued, I'm revisiting the staffing structure. No more being short-staffed during peak hours. We'll hire more people, and I'll make sure everyone gets proper breaks. You can't take care of customers if you're running on empty. Megan gave a small smile. That would be amazing. Jacob nodded. Third, I want to reward the two of you for everything you've done to keep this place afloat. Megan and Connor exchanged surprised looks. Reward us? Megan asked cautiously. Jacob nodded. Connor, you've shown incredible loyalty and leadership, even in the short time you've been here. I'm promoting you to assistant manager. You'll get a raise and more consistent hours. Connor's jaw dropped. Wait, are you serious? I've never managed anything before. Jacob smiled. You're already doing it. You've been stepping up when no one else would. That's what leadership looks like. Connor blinked, his face a mix of shock and gratitude. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Jacob turned to Megan. And you, Megan. 8 months of dedication, even when things were at their worst. I see how much you care about the customers and your coworkers. You deserve more than just a pat on the back. Megan's eyes shimmered, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed. I'm just doing my job. You're doing more than that, Jacob said gently. Starting next week, I'm giving you a significant pay raise. And I want to set up a bonus system for the staff so hard work like yours gets recognized. Megan's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, really? Really? For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. Then Megan whispered, Thank you. I mean it. Thank you, Jacob leaned back, his expression softening. You've earned it. As they finished their conversation, Jacob laid out more of his plans to improve the diner. He promised to update the outdated equipment, implement a better scheduling system, and hold regular meetings with the team to hear their concerns. By the time they left the booth, both Megan and Connor looked lighter, as if the tension that had been weighing them down for so long had finally lifted. A new beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Jacob kept his promise, spending several days at the diner, working alongside the staff and listening to their feedback. He personally interviewed candidates for the manager position, eventually hiring a woman named Denise, whose experience and empathetic leadership style quickly won over the team. True to his word, Jacob approved raises for Megan and Connor and brought in 3 new hires to ease the workload. The atmosphere in the diner transformed. Customers noticed the change too. Service was faster, and the staff seemed genuinely happy to be there. One afternoon, as Jacob prepared to leave for the corporate office, Megan stopped him by the door. Hey, she said, smiling. I just wanted to say, this place feels different now. Better. Like it actually matters. Jacob smiled. It does matter. And so do you. As he walked to his car, Jacob felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about profits or expansion anymore. It was about the people who made it all possible, and he wasn't going to forget that again. A month later, Jacob returned to the diner, this time without the disguise. The moment he stepped inside, he could feel the difference. The once tense atmosphere had been replaced with a buzz of energy and warmth. Employees moved with confidence, exchanging friendly words with customers and each other. The small but meaningful changes he had implemented were already taking effect. Megan, now more relaxed, smiled easily as she greeted customers. Connor, wearing his new assistant manager name tag, was helping a young server carry a tray of drinks to a table. Even the kitchen, once a place of stress and frustration, seemed to be running more smoothly. Jacob slid into his usual booth, watching as the staff thrived in the environment they deserved. When Megan came over to take his order, she grinned. No hoodie today? Jacob chuckled. Figured it was time for people to see me as myself. She smirked. Good, because we all know who you are now. He glanced around the diner. Things look different. Megan nodded. Denise has been amazing. She actually listens to us. And having enough staff means we aren't constantly drowning. It feels good to work here again. And the customers? They've noticed, Megan said proudly. We've been getting a lot more regulars coming back. Even got a few five-star reviews online. Jacob nodded, his chest swelling with pride. This was the diner he had envisioned when he started his business. That's because of you, Jacob said, and Connor, and the whole team. You didn't just survive through the mess Rick left behind. You helped build something better. Megan hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, I guess we did. Connor walked over a few moments later, rubbing the back of his neck. Hey, boss. Just wanted to say thanks for giving me a chance. Jacob shook his head. You earned it. Connor grinned. Still, it means a lot. You didn't just come in and fire Rick. You actually listened. Most CEOs don't do that. Jacob thought about that for a moment. He had spent years trusting reports, charts, and numbers to tell him how his business was running. But no spreadsheet could have told him what he had seen and heard in that diner. You can't fix a business from behind a desk, Jacob admitted. Sometimes you have to walk through the door, sit at a booth, and see it with your own eyes. Connor nodded. Well, whatever you did, it worked. Jacob smiled as he picked up his coffee. He knew there was still work to be done, not just here, but at every location in his chain. This experience had changed him as a leader, and he wouldn't let himself fall into the same mistakes again. A lesson in leadership. As Jacob drove back to his corporate office, he reflected on what he had learned. Numbers don't tell the whole story. Data is important, but nothing replaces real human connection. If he hadn't gone undercover, he never would have known how bad things had gotten. A toxic manager can destroy an entire business. It wasn't a staffing issue. It wasn't seasonal fluctuations. It was a lack of leadership. Good employees don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses. Small changes make a big difference. Fixing the culture of a workplace doesn't always require massive overhauls. Listening, respecting, and valuing people can be the most powerful tools a business owner has. Leadership is about action, not just words. It's easy to tell employees they are valued. It's harder to prove it. Real leaders don't just give orders. They lead by example. Never stop paying attention. Jacob had trusted that his managers were keeping things in order. He had assumed his company's values were being upheld. He was wrong. From now on, he would be more present, more involved, and never let himself be blind to the truth again. The diner lives on. A few months later, business at the diner had fully turned around. The team was thriving. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and the lessons learned here had rippled across every other location in the company. Jacob made it a habit to visit each of his diners personally, not as an executive issuing orders, but as a leader who listened. And as he sat at his booth, drinking his coffee and watching Megan and Connor lead with confidence, he realized something important. This wasn't just a restaurant business, it was a people business, and that was the real key to success.